This series of tutorials is designed to get you up and running quickly and give you the skills you need to create fantastic scenes with Forest Pack Pro. Throughout, we're going to create a number of forest objects, each designed to demonstrate a different aspect of the plugin. For ease, we've split the tutorial into 3 parts. In the first, we're going to create all the trees and the bushes you can see in the scene. This will introduce you to key Forest Pack features, and you will use splines to control the placement of objects. In the second part, we'll create the grass and flowers, introducing distribution on mesh surfaces and how to set up include and exclude areas. And in the third part, we'll look at randomizing colour, easily adding a simple colour variation using the Optimize Materials tool and Forest Colours Tint by Gradient feature. Before you start, make sure you've downloaded the starter files from the ITOOSOFT website. You'll find versions for V-Ray and Mental Ray. Open the appropriate starter file in 3ds Max and we'll get going. In the first tutorial, we're going to look at a typical workflow for Forest Pack. We'll start by selecting distribution areas to control where items are created in the scene. We'll then choose the geometry to scatter, control the density, and finally add randomized transforms to create some variety. If we have a quick look at the scene, you can see it's fairly simple. In addition to a building and a boat, a couple of ground planes, and some canal edgings, there are some splines that we can use to generate forest objects. These are very easy to create, but for simplicity they've been included in the scene file. On the left hand side, in the rectangle, are all the objects we can use to create the foliage in this scene. Over here we've got 2 types of bush. If we get in a bit closer, you can see there are a few types of flower, 3 types of grass, a leaf, and a couple of proxy objects, an oak tree on the right and the willows on the left. To get started, we'll create the trees to the left of the canal. To do so, go up to the Create panel, from the drop down choose i2 software, and then click on Forest. And you'll see that Forest's got 2 creation modes, Generate, which it's on by default, and Custom Edit. In Custom Edit mode, you add individual trees by clicking in the scene, but we'll leave it on its default Generate, which is looking for you to click on a spline or a surface as a distribution area. So with this selected, we'll come over here and pick on this spline trees 1, and you'll see that the area fills with single planes. To modify this, come over to the Modify panel, and you'll see the geometry rollout is automatically selected. But if it's not, then you just need to find geometry and click on it. And in here you can see it's already created, and it always does when you first click on a new spline, a default geometry object. If you scroll down, you can see the types of objects you can have. You can click on Library to open one of the built-in objects. You can click on Template, which is already on, and from here you have some simple geometries. It's on one plane at the moment. Alternatively, you can come down to Custom Object and you can pick something from the scene. That's what we're going to do. So click on Custom Object and you'll see the planes disappear as we're changing it. If we come over here to the left, we're going to pick the willow tree. So click on None, and then it's expecting you to pick on the geometry to scatter. And then click on the willow tree proxy. A warning will come up because we're using very high density mesh here. In order to optimize the viewports and keep everything running smoothly, it's asking us to enable a few things. So one of the things it will do is it will look at the current camera and it will limit the visibility to the cone in front of the camera. It's also going to display these trees as a point cloud instead of the actual geometry, and it's going to turn off animation until render time. It's a good idea to enable all of those. Then you see a point cloud indicating the trees you've just added. So if we come back over to the geometry area, we can see Willow is now added to this geometry list. We can have, in Pro version, unlimited items of geometry being scattered in here, or in the light version you can have up to 3. To add a bit more variety, we'll add an extra object. So the tools for adding and controlling the geometry list are all just tucked away underneath. So you can add new items, you can delete an item, you can add multiple items by clicking on that and picking them from the Add Multiple picker. And you can copy and you can paste items too if you want to duplicate them. We'll just click to add a new item, the green cross. it will say new item, and it will go back to its default template of a single plane. So to change this to the oak tree, exactly as before, come down to Custom Object, click on None, and then come over here and click on the oak proxy. And you should see your point cloud updates now, and you have two types of tree in there. So that's the first scatter done. But we also want to scatter these same trees in a number of different areas, in these splines here, and the ones up nearer the camera. So in addition to a geometry list, there's also a list that controls the number of areas that you can use in the scene. And in the Pro version again, you have an unlimited number of areas that you can use, and in the Lite version you can use up to 4. So we have an areas list here, and you can see from the list Spline Trees 1 is listed, since this is the one we've already selected. We can add other spline areas to this list by clicking on the Add New Spline Area button here. And it's also possible to add objects, other forests and paint areas. So if we click on Add a New Spline Area, under here Spline, it's already lit up and it's waiting for us to click on a spline in the scene. So if I click on this spline here, ground left, it'll automatically fill those areas with more trees. Let's add the third one, which is the one up near the camera. Again, click on Add a New Spline Area and click on the ground left spline. Now we have trees near the camera, and if I switch to camera view, you should see it starting to look something like the finished render. There are a couple of things to be aware of when using splines. They're interactive, so if we move a spline around, the trees will move to reflect it. So you can see as I move the splines, the trees are moving to represent the spline's new position. Also, unless you've got a surface selected, the highest Z point of the splines you're using will govern the height of the trees. So if I move this up, even though I'm only moving one of the splines up, they will all go up so that they are at the highest point. And finally, splines can either be include or exclude areas. So these at the moment are all include areas, they're generating trees. But if I click back on this object and pick Spline Trees 2 and make it an exclude area, you see the trees disappear. Moreover, if I select the spline and push it over into the forest, you can see it's actually starting to take away from the trees that are there. So this is a very powerful feature. We'll leave this now as an include area. And then we need to add a little bit of variety. All these trees have the same rotation and scale at the moment. By randomizing the scale slightly and the rotation, we can create a lot of variation in these trees without having to use a whole load of models. So let's make sure the trees are selected. And this time we're going to look for the rollout called Transform. And this rollout is responsible for randomizing the position, the rotation and the scale of the selected geometry. In each case it picks it from a random range determined by a minimum and a maximum value. We're just going to randomize rotation and scale for now. So the first step is to enable them. You can see it reflected in the viewports. Let's enable scale as well. And again you can see a randomized shuffle through these scales starting to happen. So with the rotation, the Z-axis was already rotating 0 to 359 degrees, so any of these trees could be rotated at any point in that range on the Z-axis, giving it a full 360 degrees of rotation. We also want to rotate them a little bit on the X and Y, just so they can tilt over to the sides ever so slightly. So we'll set the X to -5 minimum, and the X maximum to 5. Set the Y minimum to -5, and the maximum to 5, and leave the Z as it is. If we come down to scale, you can see that with scale you can lock the aspect ratio, so X, Y, Z are all affected equally. In this case I only need to change these values here and it scales proportionately on the X, Y and the Z axis. I could also control the X, Y separately and have no aspect ratio control at all, so I'm controlling each axis independently. We'll leave the default on X, Y, Z there. And actually we'll leave the range that's set by default the same too. 80 to 120 gives a nice believable range. So this completes the trees on the left hand side, and in the next step we'll use an open spline as opposed to the closed ones we've been using here to scatter trees on the right hand side just behind the fence. So since we've just set up this forest with the randomization controls, we don't want to create it all again from scratch. So click on the forest you just created and duplicate it by hitting Ctrl and V or going up to Edit and Clone. Make sure it's not an instance, and this time we'll call it forest underscore trees underscore right, and click OK. We now have two forests in the scene that are identical. What we want to do is to get to the delete the areas we've already created for this and assign some new ones. So in the modify panel, the forest selected, make sure it's trees right. Go to the areas rollout and delete all the areas that are already there. Those trees will disappear, and then we'll add back another spline area, just like before. Click on that, it's waiting for us to pick a spline, and this time we want this spline here, which is called spline trees, and click on that. Now, when you're using an open spline like this, the width either side of this spline that the trees are scattered is governed by this thickness control here, which by default on mine is set to 0.254 meters. You can see as I increase this, the trees will spread out from the sides of that spline. If we set it to about 2.2 meters, that seems to be about right. Now I know from having rendered this before, if I go to my camera view, the Willows trees, they hang a little bit low. Let's do a quick preview render to check this. Yeah, you can see the willows here. They come down across the path and kind of obscure the background a little bit. So I think for the trees on the right hand side of the path, we'll actually turn the willow off and just have oaks over here. Click on this forest and go to the geometry rollout again and find the willow model and hit the red cross to delete that item. Now all we can see here are oaks. So that's all the trees in the scene finished. In the next step we'll add the bushes to the scene using many of the same techniques, but we'll also incorporate the library so that we can load in some of the included models from the library and use them as our starting point. In addition to selecting objects from the scene, objects can be selected from Forest's built-in library. So we'll get started again by creating a whole new forest object from scratch. So I'm just going to come out to perspective view and come to create again, ITOOSoftware and Forest Pro. And I'm going to pick generate and select the same starting spline, spline trees 1. You can see in there now the planes are there. If we go to modify, down to the geometry rollout, there's our default object. Now last time we picked an object from the scene by going custom object and picking one. This time we're going to select the library button up here. So when I click on that, it brings up the library. And on the left hand side you've got your directory tree. So you've got a whole load of 2D trees that we can use over here. Classic and standard. And then we've got some 3D built-in 3D objects too. You can see there's some trees, some bushes, some palms, a fir, a maple, and all sorts. So if I want to use this bush, for example, all I have to do is select it and double click, and it's now using the bush in the scene. You can see the point cloud just down here. There's our bush. It's that easy. We can augment that with a couple of other objects from the scene by clicking, this time we'll add custom, multiple. So instead of clicking on the plus and picking them the way we did last time, let's use a new trick. We'll click on add multiple custom objects, and then from here we'll look for the bushes, bush large and bush medium, and hit add. And that's automatically added them both and assigned them as custom objects. So that's a quicker way of doing it if you know you're going to pick a couple of things. So while we were able to leave the distribution as it was for the trees, the bushes are smaller, and as you can see in there, they're a bit too spread out. So we want to change the density so the bushes are much closer together. So in order to control that, we'll go to a new rollout called Distribution Map. Now in this rollout, we can see how the trees are being distributed, and that's happening using a bitmap. And basically what's happening here is that any area which is white is a potential tree, and the black pixels are empty. And this bitmap is being laid down across the scene using this size and then being tiled in every direction. And by changing to a different bitmap, we get different distribution patterns. So for example, we're using spread 1 at the moment, and these are the built-in presets. We could try dense, and immediately we have a few more bushes because the black and white dots here are denser. We can make it denser still by changing the size of this bitmap in the scene, and we can do this by going down to the density settings here and reducing the size of the units, or number of the units. So you can see as I change this downwards, if I make this value smaller, it gets more dense. If I make it larger, they spread out. We want these really to be quite dense, so let's set this to about 32 meters. And then we get some serious undergrowth. Let's add some transform randomization to that, just like we did with the trees. So, go to transform, enable rotation, and this time we'll set this to the same as before. Actually, let's go -5, 5, -5, 5, and leave the Z as it is. And we'll enable scale, leaving the aspect ratio locked, and change it to 80. Actually is fine as a starting point, but let's make them a little bit larger to 140%. So we've got a slightly larger range there. And those are the bushes done, but we just want to add them in a couple more areas. So probably we want them under the trees near the camera too. So let's go back to areas here, click on add new spline area, and add them using the same spline. And also, just like to obscure the base of this building a little bit, so we'll also add this extra spline here. So if I click on add a new spline area, and click on this spline here, which is spline bushes 1, I believe. Just click on that, and we can see we now have the bushes coming out and lapping around the building a little too. Next we'll add some underneath the trees on the right hand side too. So just like before, duplicate the bushes we have, make sure that you've got forest, let's just name this actually, forest bushes left selected, duplicate it or clone it, Control and V, and then we'll call this one forest bushes right, and hit OK. And then in areas now we'll delete all 3 of these, add a new spline area, and come in here and click on the same one as we used for the trees on the right, and set the thickness to 2.2 to spread them out a bit. And now we have some bushes growing under those trees. And as a final step, we'll add some smaller bushes in front of this fence, just using the library bush since that's the smaller of the 3. And add a little bit of variation and use this spline here, which is another open spline, to create that. So we'll start again from a new model, a new forest object, sorry. Click on Forest Pro 3, and we need to pick this spline down here. Let's try and hit that. So there we have an area called Spline Small Hedge. If we come down here and set the thickness to 0.25, that's probably about right actually. 0.25 is fine, because we don't want it spreading far. And in the geometry rollout, we'll change the default item to the bush. So nothing much is appearing at the moment, but we'll change that with the density. So come into your distribution map, change the image being used to distribute these to dense, and set the size to about 24 meters. And now you see we've got some bushes. And finally, let's go to the transform settings. Set the scale here, enable this, and we don't want them getting too large this time. This smaller, and we don't want to obscure the fence. So let's take the maximum down to 100, and the minimum, let's make it smaller at maybe 40%. So we've sort of shrunk the size of them. And rotation enabled, and the usual -5 and 5, so that they aren't all upright, and leave the Z as it is. And that really concludes this part. That's the bushes and the trees done. In the next section, we're going to look at using surfaces instead of splines to distribute objects, and we're going to create the grass and the flowers in the scene.